Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Startup Conversations on CGconnect. I'm your host, Roderick Bates, and today I have a very special guest. I think it's the first time I've had a guest where I cornered them in person at an event and asked if they would be a guest. I guess they couldn't say no in that environment. So I have Marissa Ritchen with Kestrel Labs join us. So welcome. Thank you for joining
Roderick.
us.
Thanks so much for having me. Our unbridled enthusiasm for being cornered led us all here, so that's great.
Absolutely. Well, I like to think I made a compelling pitch for the little show we have here.
Yes.
But also, I cornered you very specifically because one of the people that I listen to very carefully, or I guess one of the media outlets I listen to very carefully is Architosh. And I asked the editor-in-chief at the AIA event who they thought was sort of the top technology that they saw at that show. So this was the AIA National Conference, and there's obviously a lot of companies there. And they said, the one that caught their attention the most was Kestrel Labs. And so when I saw an event where you were speaking, I said, oh, this is someone I have to have on the show. So really excited about that aspect of it. And perhaps I got a little bit of a lowdown on what you folks do, but a lot of people listening, they may be totally unfamiliar with Kestrel Labs. So what is it that you do, and what do you think got the folks at Architosh so excited?
That is incredibly flattering. I think, Kestrel Labs is a comprehensive compliance analysis that works within Revit to do code compliance while you are designing. Our founders, Marion and Austin, were kind of deeply rabbit-holed and frustrated in their experience of Marion on kind of the art and development side, working on a public works project in Denver, getting stuck in permitting delays, while her husband, Austin, was kind of saying, oh yeah, that's just how it is. And through their collaborative mind power saying, we should change that paradigm, that the hardest, most kind of frustrating part of design and architecture and building should not be code compliance and permit review. So that was kind of the ethos of building Kestrel Labs, which is, meant to be integrated into the workflow where architects are really working. I'm our chief industry officer, so another licensed architect on the staff, and we really think, part of our conversations with Architosh and what we feel distinguishes us is that it's, by architects for architects, that this really comes from a deep love of design and the profession and wanting to be lifelong learners and folks who bring people up through the profession to be expanding and growing, this really kind of special, optimistic industry, as opposed to being eternally frustrated and harrowed in the process.
I thought that was part and parcel with architecture, was being somewhat frustrated.
I think you're not wrong, and you can definitely still retain that identity, as I well do, but letting it be directed at potentially more productive aims.
I think that's a good way of putting it. I remember when I was first starting architecture, there was, I don't even know if they're still around, but there was a Banana Republic had a advertisement series where they were showing architects, and it was all these people looking very serious, in dark black clothes and whatnot.
Always.
And people are like, this doesn't look right at all. Like they should have bags under their eyes, unshaven, things like that. These people didn't sleep in their office.
Yeah, so, it really comes from the idea that no one gets into architecture with a passion for code compliance. If someone listening did, no offense, we want your warm and inclusive perspective as well.
That brings actually that might be a perfect segue to a first question, because I happened to, just before AIA, was sitting at a table at the Center for Architecture at an event, and I was between a lawyer, a real estate lawyer, and an architect who in New York, that's what they did. They were actually their firm specialized in facilitating code compliance for if you're working, you're doing a project in New York, you didn't normally work in New York, they were going to be your right-hand person for going through all of that process. And I actually asked him about code compliance, just sort of off the cuff, and he said, and if, it's not going to be a direct quote, but it's a pretty decent one. He said, everything's a negotiation, is what he said. It was like everything was a negotiation. And then when I saw you at a Trimble event saying, oh, we can basically automate, a lot of stuff's binary. It's either you comply or you don't. Then I was like, well, that doesn't sound like a negotiation. So I'm curious on your thoughts there. Like, how does it work? Because is that just a New York thing, or is that everywhere? And is there some that's binary versus that negotiation?
New York is such an interesting use case because one of the first firms that I worked at had an interpretation of the zoning code that we did 2 or 3 separate buildings for a client who had a jewelry showroom, and they have all these back of house offices that need no light, no air, etc. So we had developed a system where if you pull the floor plate back like 24 inches, you get vertical space that's leasable, because they had a wonderful corner location in the jewelry district. They had one coming right off on the Bowery,
2 feet
right
matters.
Before you went onto the bridge. 2 feet matters. You can sell it as a billboard, but it's not a signage, so you're not controlled by zoning, and it's not leasable interior space, so you're kind of shaking it out, but essentially you can give that back and have a whole other tenancy on the vertical face of your building. So it's an interpretation of zoning code to say there's nowhere it doesn't say you can do this. Negotiation. But things like, do people have the right amount of stair space? Do they have the right amount of turning radius? Things that are a little bit more kind of like quality of life equitably focused. I think,
like ADA stuff. I mean, I don't think that's a negotiation, is it?
No, I don't think so either. And I think, kind of our service and optimism also is like, you don't want to negotiate on that. That if you know enough about the code constrictions early, it doesn't rob you of your design. It's not a roadblock. It's a tool to be wielded. I think particularly as I was coming out of school, I was in school through the Great Recession. So we were having our professional practice class where folks were coming back and essentially doing the Billy Madison grab your face, don't ever leave here kind of thing. Of you're going to have a bad time. You're going to do ADA diagrams and stair details. You'll never design, it'll crush your soul. And we're all going to oh no, we're quite a ways down this line. It's slightly too late to turn back. And I think that that's kind of an antiquated view of the looming specter of code compliance. So if you know what is required of you, you can really creatively wield it, and it can be a tool with your team where you're working within constraints, as opposed to you can do whatever you want and then you learn about code compliance and it ruins your vision. Our kind of thinking is really, if you have these constraints early and you understand them, you can work within them to do exactly what you want and interpret and set out. And that, if 80% of compliance is black and white, then you provide those things. And then that 20% leaves you kind of this wonderful array of levers to push and pull.
And this is like the Ray and Charles Eames movie, for anyone that hasn't seen it, right?
Yes.
Where they say constraints are opportunities.
Absolutely.
I like that mentality, and I think that's a good one. And so then it says, okay, well, if constraints are opportunities here, you really need to know what those constraints are, right? You need to be really focused to make sure that your scope is correct, right? It's focused on the things that are more binary or black and white as far as compliance. How do you do that in the context of your software? What's the whole process look like? Can you walk me through a little bit from sort of a technical and workflow perspective, and maybe underlying data perspective?
So starting from kind of the understanding that there is so much data already in the 3D modeling programs that exist, essentially.
But there's also a lot of bad data, right?
There's a lot of bad data. And I think what's been really interesting also is in the conversations we've been having, our kind of original idea was we don't want to constrain firms, practices, users to say you have to model it just like this. Very much coming from that world of practice of everyone models a little bit differently. There's different kind of standards, not only from firm to firm, but from person to person within the firm. And what we've learned that has surprised all of us, Austin and myself in particular, is people are open to changing some of their practices.
No way.
If the incentive structure is there.
Okay, and
To
so
be like,
clearly, in the context of chaos, our incentive structure is not sufficient, but it is for yours.
Well, I think it's like, even talking about door schedules, to have a concrete example, it's like, you obviously can model it all parametrically and have your hardware families and all of this data baked into your families, your types, your parameters. But if you're pushing on a deadline and you've done 17 different layouts, the inclination as a designer is always to say, okay, let's refine this a little bit. Let's work through one more option. Let's not make sure we're populating our schedule correctly. But, with Kestrel, we're saying, if you start with good data, that will happen and be checked for you. That you won't then need to have someone in your firm spending 3 days comparing door schedules to wall schedules to ratings to data, that it is happening essentially as in real time as is helpful to your design ethos, so that it doesn't have to be an afterthought.
Let me get to a thorny question here, though. And
sure.
I used AI to look through your EULA, because that seems to be a thing, right? And you have a liability cap, which makes a lot of sense. You're a startup, right? You got to be careful.
Totally.
But you're starting to do things that are getting really into the liability question, right? And in that context, you just mentioned an example of okay, you don't need to do this, but you still need to do it.
Yes. Well, I think,
so what do you think that negotiation should look like, right?
I think that negotiation is one way or another, the work needs to be done. And if we have a deterministic model. So speaking of AI, it's that we use AI to process the building codes on the front end. And we use AI as a chat feature once you have already run the compliance analysis and want to further discuss essentially potential exemptions. But that AI data, is based only on licensed legal documentation that we have in collaboration with the ICC. So it's
your own, you've defined the training set. It's not like an LLM that's just kind of...
No, and it's not on, Reddit threads of, hey, this worked one time in Seattle with an examiner in 2012, see if it works for you. We've really narrowed the specificity. That would be interesting to know. Yeah. And I think, we really think about this as such a trust-based industry, both in terms of can the architect using it trust that this has done the right job? And so, it is deterministic. If you run it 1,000 times, you are going to get the exact same result 1,000 times. And so that kind of rigor in testing is, we know what is and is not checked and the level to which it is held. So everything that we
that
release...
makes a lot of sense. So if we break apart the pieces here, right, you have the model part, right, and then you're running a scan of the model, and then you're comparing it against a data set that you've pulled from IBC. Is that correct?
Right now, IBC, yes, but it's essentially, we have a licensure agreement and not a partnership, but a collaboration essentially with the ICC. So the entirety of their iCodes library is available to us. That's what we are vetting and building this system with.
And does that pass through to local sort of interpretations, if you will, of that?
Yes, piece by piece. So we're starting with this initial launch is IBC 2021. We have IBC 2024 and 7 state codes that we are doing our internal vetting currently. And then we're doing
this is the beauty
city
of being
overlays.
A startup, right? You can build out as you with the customers.
Our CTO always says land and expand to
makes
start getting
sense.
something.
Absolutely.
And an ethos also that better is good. It doesn't have to be entirely comprehensive each time, but we need to make sure that we have a mechanism to let folks know what is and isn't checked. So it doesn't have to be everything immediately, but it needs to be the things that it needs to be very good at.
I like
so
that,
that's
though.
what
it
we're
tells you what it's
building
not,
from.
right? Yeah, it's not
Totally.
saying, oh, you passed. It's saying these things passed.
Mm-hmm. And it's,
then after
even at the minutia of right now, we've set it up to check every single sink, every single toilet for ADA clearances. And it's well, not every single one needs to be ADA. And we're working to refine of okay, how are we differentiating which ones do and don't need? how is that delineated in the model by the user, or is it just that we're going to check every single one every time and people can dismiss the ones that aren't applicable? That level of refinement of what is the best workflow to make sure that we are catching everything and then showing people what's useful back to them, as opposed to, hey, look at everything we caught.
And what is useful? Are you finding that customers have different desires to see as far as what's useful?
Yeah, definitely. Something that as someone who left architecture kind of 4-ish months ago, I really value the opportunity to spend so much time talking to architects and practitioners and different firms and really understanding kind of the wide array of the beauty of architects' use cases. It is such a varied industry, and it's so interesting to me to understand the one-off weird specialties that folks have, to be like, oh, we really would love a table that is checking the scale of our hazardous materials. And we're like, oh, interesting. We can build that for you. So, it's not an a la carte menu to work with us, but it is that we want to kind of encompass the widest array possible. So, even as far as municipalities and jurisdictions, we have our own roadmap that we think is, the most important and kind of all-encompassing in terms of cities and overlays and additional code jurisdictions, but also that so much of that is guided by our initial partnerships and relationships with firms of folks who do a lot of work in Seattle or South Florida or Boston,
Well, so there's a good question. I'm just thinking about that. I did a software way back when that was life cycle analysis. So I looked at the embodied environmental impacts of things. And one of the challenges I would think in that context is there was a certain bias. It was like you said, Seattle, California, New York, like certain areas figured very prominently on our customer list. But then there are other areas that didn't. And of course, code, LCA, maybe that has something where it's somewhat regionally of interest. Of course, it's relevant everywhere, but code really is relevant everywhere, and it's of interest everywhere. So how do you make sure that you don't listen too hard to someone in a place that maybe doesn't have, they care a lot about it, but they don't represent a big market? Like, how do you balance, I guess, that sort of that passion of early adopters versus the broadest market applicability in the long term?
It's definitely a tightrope to some extent, but the procurement process for AEC tools, I think there's so much hype around AI and additional tools to make your workflow better, and et cetera, sales pitch. From, you were at AIA. There's so many different folks. You better up your pitch if that's
your pitch.
Oh, trust me. But, we really want to work in very close partnership with people. So folks who are serious early on, we see that, recognize that. It's speed of conversation. It's like detail-oriented technology teams that are coming in and saying, this is exactly what we need. And, the specificity of that request from folks with agency within their businesses really helps guide us of, we run these kind of initial partnerships where we'll start with like 3 to 5 projects with a firm, and we really refine what it looks like for Kestrel to work with them. So it's,
that's a big obligation though, 3 to 5
100%.
projects, a number of firms, like that's, you folks have to be busy.
Oh, we are. Mercifully,
well, I really appreciate you taking the time.
It is the best case scenario for us to try to slot in all these different things and to be working through both, a lot of it is analysis of our own conversations of what's the commonality, what are we working through, we're not a big team also, so we are in constant conversation with each other of, hey, this came back from this firm and they're saying the same thing, so let's make sure we're refining this. And we're also doing a lot of internal testing, being architects ourselves and the users of, hey, this weird thing is popping up on an old model that I was just tinkering around with. We are iterators, we are tinkerers. So stuff is popping up on our own. It honestly really is.
So what's the slam dunks, though? I'm curious, like, what are the projects a firm comes to you and you're like, oh, we got this?
big, complicated, repetitive projects of like
So
multifamily hotels. I spent a lot of time doing boutique hospitality at my firm in California, and we did work all over the country. It's hotels is so much of it, and then kind of specialty one-offs of schools. We've looked at single family residences and we've caught some really interesting things, but that's also such a unique use case that a lot of times comes down to zoning. So as we look at those overlays, it's been wonderful to have conversations about, oh, we, use this specific exemption from this part of Sun Valley's zoning code that had like partial adoption, the kind of intricacies and minutia. It's fun to see.
But how do you make
such a
that
wide array
scalable?
of types.
Can you make that scale? That sort of. Is there a way in which you see a future for Kestrel where you can start to work those types of edge cases and unique zoning?
Totally, and I think a lot of what empowers us to ingest that additional data comes from our brilliant engineering team and the way that they are processing codes. So as we, to the land and expand model, like we start with IBC and then we do state overlays, but as we ingest these additional codes, we're also setting them up to have the hierarchy of that legal text. So we know how exemptions are written and built.
So where are these other databases? Like, where are you finding something? Like, so this is like manual documents?
Some of it
PDFs.
It started out originally being kind of a manual documents. There are actually, additional folks who are doing some of these things. There's companies who are set up to, pay attention to municipal level releases of refinements of things. So it's a lot of kind of ear to the pavement, nose to the grindstone combination of things.
I bet. This is like, my sister works for a company that does legal research, or well, I guess they provide the legal documents, but they actually have people that will go to courts and get documents and scan them and stuff because there isn't a process. You're like, wow, this is manual.
Yes, I don't know if this is still the case, but for a period of time, a friend of mine was a public defender. We were living together in New York, and DOJ in New York doesn't email. They only fax or call. And so they lost one of her clients. Like, it's such a bizarre, the city world is so fascinating of like where
fax,
people.
Wow. I didn't even know where do you even find a fax machine at this point? I mean, I guess maybe Amazon, but
I guess also this should be curtailed in the fact that was quite some time ago. I'm like, this was many moons ago.
No, but it's true. Even if you look at some aspects of architecture, like construction side, like you'll still see documents that are faxed and things like that.
I mean, I have been on a job site in the last 2 years that everything is on Procore. All the drawings are publishable. A tradesperson is holding an iPad with the current set on it, and there's a printed set from 3 months ago that is what they're building off of, and it boggles the mind.
It's like truly, it's like being honest.
Wait, but it's right there. So, it is some of that, and I think the city expansion is a long-ish term roadmap. I mean, the thing is that even from when Marion and Austin founded the company through now, the ability to process documentation, to acquire it, the fact that we have this relationship with ICC has made our lives so much easier too in terms of like document procurement. The brave new world of what it is that, a Fable weekend versus a Sonnet weekend in terms of our processing ability of documentation is like, it's different week to week and it's getting better each time. And so it's really up to us to be that human in the loop input of, okay, this is where we're focusing our attention. This is who we're serving with that attention. And that's really our guidepost of what can we do and what's the best way to do that thing we can.
So there's two questions that come to mind from there. The first one is, how do you manage costs, right? Like a Fable weekend could, I don't know, is it available in the back now? I'm not sure if it is, but it could be really expensive depending upon how you do it, right? So does your firm, or your startup have certain policies for AI optimization and utilization?
We definitely do, and again, like we're not a large team, so our CTO
you really know
is really,
up.
yeah. and we flog them publicly every time we learn.
Mercilessly.
We've set up internal reporting structures also that like everyone in leadership gets a report of all of our users, everything that's run, what's caught. We are data people generally, and so being able to synthesize of like early and often understanding what we need to see helps us, kind of nimbly maneuver through there.
Yeah, I can see that. And when you do something like that, have you seen a situation then where you're running an analysis? You say, you have a weekend where you're doing this type of ingestion, but your code is not static, right? You have people that are probably still using versions of code from 2015, and you maybe people are using, 2024 might be some of the newer stuff.
Indiana's 2012.
2012, right? So, and are you able to even? Is there some of the stuff where don't even have API access to it? How do you do a renovation on a building, right? Where you need to know like what the original code was to see if it conforms to the current standards for.
What a great question. We've been using IEBC for those things, and like the parsability, this is the thing also is we can give a lot of data. We can parse it through, we can apply it back against these digital models, but at the end of the day, we think human in the loop at some point, both on our end, pretty rigorously, and making sure that we are telegraphing back to the designer what is and isn't checked, that like, this is a learning tool, this is a guidepost, this is not taking all of code compliance off of your plate in its entirety.
Which sounds really nice if you could, but yeah.
Which would be absolutely wonderful. And I think part of the reason that you can't, and I've said a lot of really optimistic things, this is one of my more cynical takes, is like we're a country who sues people. So, even in looking at, we've had conversations with international firms that like the requirements for guardrails and stair rails are vary so much from country to country as well. All those beautiful staircases you see in Mexico City with no banister, like all these beautiful things, then it's like, well, we're litigious, so we can't let you do that. ADA is a legal framework. So at the end of the day, this is prompting and guiding, but is meant to facilitate those conversations so that you can have those beautiful designs that do exactly what you envision as a team in the world, in space, in public, interaction with community, but also that take that liability off your plate.
So this brings to mind a couple of things. I always like looking to the future a little bit, and I have one question is, if you think of like the data that you have access to right now, what is the one missing piece of data where if Kestrel Labs had it, you'd think, oh, this would be the can opener to a lot of opportunity?
What a great question. I don't know yet. And I think that that's something that's kind of wonderful.
Nothing.
No, we know everything. Don't worry about it. No, I think it's really, there's such a variety of asks. And I think something that's so wonderful about architecture and design and AEC is like each use case, most projects are kind of an edge case. And so the opportunity to keep reinventing the wheel is that we will always find additional things that it's like, oh, I wish we had known a little bit more about this, or we didn't know that people were modeling in XYZ way, or that, Big Sky was just about to adopt this new community overlay that availed itself of.
Yeah, even if the buildings don't change, just the locality and the constant dynamics of even just local politics are probably going to make it a continually moving benchmark. Although I haven't figured data centers. Have you done any data centers?
We have not. We've had a lot of conversations about them, and I think, obviously there's so much conversation about their use case, their building, their resources.
I like you say conversation, not controversy.
Yeah. I'm an optimist. Listen, both can be true. The impact of those kind of infrastructural works, we've also had like both horizontal and vertical infrastructure conversations about like trains, hospitals, utilities, with the advent of people trying to kind of work through what different nuclear power sources would look like. We're engaged in a lot of the kind of big picture understanding of what some of those futures may be, and trying to understand, what we've built is it's not necessarily limited to AEC in the end, that it's a way to kind of parse and understand the world and the legal framework around it.
Oh, that's big. Let's unpack that before I go back to my other question. Now my question I was going to ask seems awfully petty in the context
never.
of that statement. So this is, maybe we're getting to like the long-term vision of Kestrel here, perhaps?
I think that's definitely part of it, is that we don't see, yes, AEC, and that this is an evolution of kind of what BIM and code compliance has foretold, that the first round is kind of digitized books and being able to look up code sections, and then it's looking at 2D plan review, and this is kind of the third iteration of kind of BIM compliance analysis, that we are really looking at everything that is in your model, that designers take so much time putting data into these things, this being kind of the third generation. If we really look at what all of that work has entailed against all of this legal text and framework. So, it's an ingestion of 3D modeled exigent structures against, the constraints that are written in a certain framework, I guess.
So you mentioned two things then that I think are interesting. One is the 3D model, right? And so you were talking earlier about larger scale infrastructure and things like that. And that makes you think, oh, well, is MicroStation next on the attack plans here? And because there's a lot of other things, right? Yeah, there's bigger scale, right? You need to get to where the 3D models. There's a lot of 3D models out there. And then the second piece is you said what's written. And then I'm thinking, but there's a lot of things where it's like almost, is it always what's written? You're comparing against what's written, but the model doesn't always, it's sort of like the interaction of additional data with that model that can sometimes tell you if things comply. Like say like an egress plan or something, like there's a component here where to test it, you actually, there's certain models that you might run against it, right? Versus like, okay, so what's my, sort of like a performance versus prescriptive in some ways. And like same thing with energy models and things like that. So I'm curious on where you see that interaction happening. So one is, okay, are we looking at other platforms in the future going beyond Revit? And then two, are we also thinking about ways in which you start to combine what's been written, the model, plus perhaps some more, an additional intermediate layer of analysis that mediates between the two?
Definitely to all of those cases. Additional platforms, Revit is kind of the largest, the most behemoth-y, so that was the logical place to start. But yes, definitely looking at SketchUp, Trimble Connect, Rhino, Grasshopper, ArchiCAD, basically anywhere that
those are
folks...
all pretty architecture, right? They're not infrastructure necessarily.
They're not yet. And I think, part of it is...
But do you know something about what these companies are planning that the rest of us don't?
Well, I think what's interesting about Autodesk as a behemoth is that it keeps taking it all, on... Yeah. And so, we have a wonderful... Marion and Austin did 0 to 60 with Trimble. So part of it is also just being in conversation. I don't know that we feel that Kestrel needs to be the author of every single one of these things, but being in conversation, being understanding, and that we want to meet these makers of things where they are. I think we definitely see an arm for development and being on kind of like that feasibility and accountability. Part of it is, sharing back and forth in terms of what that data is revealing, it being kind of like a gut check in process that can then additionally be used for schedules, for marketing. The more you know about a project, the more useful that subsequent planning becomes. And, project here in the most expansive terms of both architectural project, infrastructural project, on and on and on.
It's funny you say where the companies are, because you think, especially this day and age, things move really fast. It's like Trimble. You mentioned them, like well, they're working on like an MCP server for their products. So maybe you're going to be integrating directly with Claude or something, and prompting your SketchUp to get your
It's fascinating to see their like prompting, describing, and you can build a SketchUp model from your Claude descriptions, which I don't think that's where the architectural profession is heading. But in conversations with friends, we're like, I just want to be able to convey to my contractor or to my wife like what I am thinking about this space, to be able to write it out and say, hey, it could be this. The possibility of ideating, I think, is really interesting and is somewhat separate from the possibility of grounding and launching a built environment in the real world. So I think both those ideas are fascinating and there's use cases for them, but they're almost bifurcated.
They're bifurcated, but a lot of buildings aren't that. They're just boxes.
That's
fair.
We
talked about data centers, right? I feel like I could prompt a data center. I mean, honestly, I don't know. I shouldn't be speaking ill of data centers. I mean, there's a lot of complexity I don't realize.
This is a safe space to speak ill of data centers.
Right. But it is an interesting thing where you think about that, and what do you want when you're doing that type of workflow? Well, you want to have something that you want to be able to apply these constraints. Right? And you don't want necessarily to do a check after the fact. You'd rather have those constraints applied while it's actually happening.
And I think that's an interesting thing that we've been learning a lot in terms of kind of zoning and planning as we look into those additional overlays of like, do you want to essentially see a box first? But I think going back to kind of that initial conversation about code interpretation in New York, the New York City Planning Guide gives you a bunch of diagrams of like, this is how you think about the base of a building and the setback and like the sun angle plane that you need to hit. The lowest common denominator of compliance with those zoning codes will yield, kind of boring buildings, potentially. And so, but if you understand that envelope first, it's like, okay, you can build anything you want within this invisible fencing, essentially. So I think that's, again, going back to the idea that we want a human in the loop, that's where this creativity is being borne out, that if you understand those constraints, they can be tools to wield.
So I'm curious, when you think about where you are right now, you're saying yes, like complies, doesn't comply, not checked, or maybe out of scope. Do you think there's a place within that where it's like, hey, you could flex this, or maybe this is an area to push and negotiate? Do you want to get into that business of looking for gray area?
I think we want to be prompting people to interpret code further. That, our stance as of now, and again, subject to change forever, is that we want to essentially give you the most information as early as it is useful. So doing occupancy studies, egress studies, kind of quick and dirty understanding of your spaces, so that when you are doing, let's say, ADA seat counts and sculpting the bar, that you have an opportunity to do 20 different sketches of what your ADA drop looks like with knee clearance and toe clearance and turning radius, but it looks like this beautiful sculpted piece of stone or whatever your design intent is. And because you don't have to spend 4 days checking all your grab bars, looking at all your fire separations between occupancies, looking at your door maneuvering clearances, that you as a team can take that mind power and place it on real iterative collaborative design with kind of the black and white application.
Is it better to be a check or a guide? It's like, I always think of, let's say your computer crashes and you lose the document. It's always worse to write it the second time.
Yes.
And, so I'm wondering here, is it better to tell you, just to guide you as you go, or because right now it sounds like it's a little bit retroactive in the sense of like, oh, this didn't pass, you need to change this piece. Is it better? So which do you think there's a better way to go about it? Because the other side of it, I'm like, well, I kind of want the unfettered creativity, and not to be hemmed in with any consideration other than a very loose understanding of code initially.
I think where we see it really is that you are getting kind of the old way is like, you get to a certain extent or a certain design milestone and you print a PDF and you hand that off to your team or to a 2D plan reviewer or whatever it may be that's going to give you that input. That there's a staticness to that experience as opposed to you're working through designs, you're shifting walls, you're playing with kind of spatial layouts. You can hit to run an occupancy check and understand, oh, I need one more door or I don't. So it's meant to give you kind of real-time feedback as you are thinking and working through options, the way that designers are saying, okay, here's the pro-con list of option A. It gets us, a few more bar seats, but we lose a few banquettes, or this gets us, 2 more floors, but those floors are 30% smaller. So getting inputs of data that a designer can then apply back out for, and I think this is the best route forward.
So
is
real
really
time
the
is really
intent.
key. It
Yes,
really needs
definitely.
to be real time.
Totally. And, it's not move a door, get a violation pop up. It's, I've completed this thought. Let me make sure it works the way I think it does. And especially for, younger staff coming through, folks who are, not well versed in code compliance early on to understand, like, okay, I can be using this as a thought partner of if my PM said, hey, go give me 4 options for a layout of this classroom, that you have 4 options that work before you're in discussion with your senior architect or whoever it may be.
You definitely don't want to show something that doesn't meet code, right? What's the point?
100%. And it's like, well, that's demoralizing. And that kind of goes back to the idea, of that first spectral idea of code compliance of this is going to ruin your dreams and like this is going to be a bad time, as opposed to if you have an understanding of what works and what doesn't, it's tied back to IBC, it's tied back to you understand where it comes from. It's not someone being petty or ruining your dreams. You can work within those constraints to produce something that both has your beautiful intent and functions. I think to your idea of like, I want to be able to work unfettered. Yes, absolutely. But that's kind of gets into art, not architecture at a certain extent. Like,
yeah, you
so
want to have a
many
sense of
people have
gravity,
it,
right?
Totally.
There's still some rules that you have to conform,
Yeah.
but you don't want them to be too heavy-handed. It's an interesting balance. But it's the same thing with like budget. I'm thinking here, I was like, okay, when I was in the context of architecture, I cared about, well, what did it look like? How did it perform? And how much does it cost?
Yep.
And then I'm like, well, in the context of performance, there's like kind of like code performance and things like that. But this other piece is like, well, you got to make sure it actually within the budget. You don't want to have the gold-plated faucets or something. I mean,
Yeah.
who knows what you're designing, right? But how does that work? Do you think, is there other variables where you're looking at this and you're saying, okay, code was one of these challenging pieces that needs to be there. Maybe not as a heavy hand, but just sort of this, I don't know, dark matter of the universe that you're aware of and guides things in a general sense. Are there other pieces that you see as being really important that operate at that same level? They're there, that you don't want to be too
it's
heavy-handed?
interesting to think about like what it would look like to have an input of budget immediately as you design. I think
But you don't want it absolute either, right? You
No,
always want the budget to be kind of loose.
I was going to say, I see this getting very dark very quickly, that like you hand it over to your developer client and they're like, okay, well, if we switch these 7 things, now we've saved, $700,000 and we can do 2 more units. And you're like, oh, no. This is not a spreadsheet. Like, please stop designing a spreadsheet. So, there is so much in code compliance. I think that is very much our focus for the next few years at the very least.
But you people you're talking to must be trying to incorporate other thinkings, right? So is this like a
Definitely.
partnership play? How do you see yourself playing nice with all the other types of analysis that people want
I
to do?
think the opportunity for partnership is wonderful, particularly, the kind of set of here's all your AEC tech stack, and you're paying for Revit, and you're paying for Adobe Suite, not to name names, I guess, that I already have. But,
Those are the expensive names.
exactly. Like the expansiveness of tools you can use comes down to, from firm to firm, them discerning, what is the most helpful. And for us, from that architectural perspective, it's why don't we nail these things in terms of what ends up costing so much of your time and money as a mental load. And that, the turnaround for permit review, that ultimately, this is both an architectural tool, and that we see we're in conversation with different AHJs as well to say, like, okay, from a start, how can this work essentially as like the TSA pre-check of permit review? So if you have a Kestrel
I was going to throw you a
report-
softball question. I guess now it's a softball question because I was going to ask about that because you were talking about compliance. It's like, yeah, well, you can do all you want, but then you hand it over to someone, and then all of a sudden it's like getting stuck in mud.
Yeah,
at
and
the
I think,
reviewing authority.
our intent is really, again, for this to make everyone's life better. And again, I know that's very Pollyanna-ish, but the idea that we could go to an AHJ and say, here's a 3D analysis, here is absolutely everything we checked, again, because we're grounded in that ICC data, because it's deterministic, it's not interpretive, it's not squishy, but that it's, legally binding and dependable, to say all of these things were checked as per all of these code regulations. So now you, as a plan reviewer with the architect, can take the remaining, 20% of items that require interpretation and be in discussion about those things.
So when you see that, we talked about faxes earlier and things like that, right? So are you finding that maybe that my view of these various compliance authorities within various municipalities being kind of antediluvian is misguided, or are they actually more sophisticated than I'm thinking?
I don't know that you're off base, unfortunately. But I think, there's so much political momentum, but not as, necessarily a movement, but rather a reaction of politics as people's opinion. That different states and municipalities are passing kind of jurisdictional level, people-based policy saying you have to be able to review things faster. We have to be able to build faster. We have to be able to do this more efficiently. And if you don't, here are the kind of legal outsets that a constituent can go to, of be it an outside reviewer or third party, there's other ways that they're trying to implement this legislation, essentially. And even when you think about like California and the rebuild, that it's like, okay, we can, review you through this specific type that we know it's zoned for XYZ, thinking about kind of a WPA style, what would it look like to have another set of case study houses? Or what would it look like to say, we have a 3D plan check. We are going to actually read your model instead of a 2D analysis. What if you submit your model? What does that look like? What does that unlock for folks? I think there is a lot of need nationally, and that it's a kind of bipartisanly identified problem of we have such a housing shortage, and thinking about the ways that this can empower not only architects but like full communities to have a better opportunity to build and to grow and to kind of develop communities, cities, infrastructure. That, that coming back to Marianne and Austin's origin story of Kestrel, if there has to be a better way, I think is a shared thread that we really look to kind of apply ourselves into.
So you made a choice in the chicken and egg debate here. It looks like you said that I don't know. I guess
Yes.
whatever the architects is where you're starting. I'm not sure if that's the chicken or the egg, but that's where you're starting.
Same.
Is there a reason why you didn't start on the municipal side? Because it seems like in a lot of ways that was the actual bottleneck. I mean, the other one's a creativity bottleneck, and like you say, it's mental load. But when you think about where the inefficiencies are often occurring, they're actually on that approval side.
I mean, I think part of it comes from the kind of creative, empathetic side of, Austin being an architect and saying, there's ways that we certainly can improve this on our own, and let's start with what we know deeply and intimately. The technological depth of here's what's in Revit, here are kind of where it's being essentially underutilized. So it was really from a basis of this is where we are now, and beginning, it's definitely a slow procurement process, and firms have a lot being thrown at them and a lot of kind of competing technological
not to say that it's a faster
draws.
process. I mean, it's still
No.
slow. Yeah.
But I think it's a slow process, but it's definitely faster than going to the AHJs.
So when you think of these approval authorities, or even in architecture firms, have you found that there is a resistance to AI or taking over people's jobs? I don't know if you recall, but at the event with Trimble that you spoke at AIA, particularly amongst the folks that were younger or maybe emerging professionals, there was a very uncomfortable relationship with AI amongst them.
Yeah.
And are you finding that at all with your technology? Even though it's deterministic, it's still something that brings efficiency to a process. Efficiency is a double-edged sword in a lot of ways.
Definitely. I think we've definitely heard that. And I think there's also a lot of AI skepticism that's very warranted for architects of folks are coming and saying, we can do all this and we'll propose how to fix your model and it'll be 3 clicks and you're done. Coming from the profession, it's also like, I don't want you to fix my model. If you shift something to make it code compliant, oh no, but I had that aligned because we were creating a niche on the other side, and it is compliant, but it's no longer designed. And I think that architects, rightly, are very protective of the last thing I want to do is outsource my design time to something that's going to be worse at it.
Agreed.
I think that is something we can mostly all agree on.
Do you think that's today's attitude, or do you think is that gonna be tomorrow's attitude?
What a great question. I don't know. I think that people can tell when you take humans out of art, and that it's.
But we've already done that in some respects with some fields. I mean, maybe not to a benefit, actually. We do a lot with movie making software. Right? And you look at sort of the film era where people were doing on, I don't know, whatever the Kodak film was, right? And there's a certain quality, and just the way that you had to light scenes, and everything had to be really overlit and whatnot to really pop on the film. And then compared to digital, where that's not the case. And you're right. Maybe the tools and the way in which people are involved, or just the analog nature of it, did change the medium. But same thing happened with Revit. It's like you ended up with a lot more rectilinear buildings, it seemed like.
Sure. And I think, that there's obviously benefits. I mean, this is what we are positing, is that AI is very helpful in interpreting things that can black and white be done. But that kind of the resistance to using it as a tool to create, I think people will correctly perceive where there is lacking humanity. And
it seems like they do, but of course not all buildings are great architecture.
100%. And I think that's it too, as we were speaking about what can this do for budget, that there will always be certain types of building that it's like, well, you built a spreadsheet and that's okay for this
You
instance.
built a spreadsheet. I'm going to use that one. Hope you don't mind.
By all means.
I feel like that should be a sticker that you can put on someone's desk. The worst insult possible in an architecture firm.
I can't stress enough how much that would hurt my feelings. But I think, going to firms and partnering with them and saying, we also want this to be a learning tool. There's a reason that when you get the violations report in Revit, it's tied both to the element ID of what's built, and it's tied to an IBC code section. And it's
That's
saying
this
is exactly the constraint. Totally.
You need, because that's how you learn. It's like
100%.
I was talking to someone who trains guide dogs for the blind, and they said that essentially you have to correct the dog within 30 seconds of the violation. Longer than that, ain't gonna happen. And I feel like it's kind of the same thing when you're working on a building. It's like you need to know right away.
And that, that repetition of like, okay, I understand this. And that, again, going back to kind of quality of modeling, that this becomes essentially like a reward cycle of, oh, I know that needs to be rated. I know I need to put it in this part of the family type in our Revit model that's drawn from this line. And then I know that it'll pass and I won't have to deal with this again. And it doesn't necessarily need to be the 10,000 hours of studying door and wall ratings, but it becomes second nature, and that's something that happens through years of practice. So this being an additional kind of learning tool that we are not trying to replace junior architects. I think, kind of the highest best use for this part of the tool right now is that it stops that long QA/QC of trying to get a principal's or a PM's time of, we need a fresh set of eyes to review a static PDF set that was printed 3 days ago, took 45 minutes to print from our Revit set, and has now been sitting in Bluebeam review for 3 days, and we've already changed 7 things about it. So that real-time input.
I think that's great too, because so much of AI, and thinking of the younger, like I said, those emerging professionals that are really AI antagonistic, and what you've just said is, in fact, AI can be a learning tool in a way of like, okay, this is a way in which it will actually help you get the skills more quickly, as opposed to this is going to replace you. It's the building needs to comply. It's going to have a person in the loop. Like your $10,000 liability cap says, no matter what, the architecture firm's going to be responsible.
Yeah.
So when you do this, I'm thinking, do people have? There must be a means where they can go back and review and kind of see the argument that's put forward, right? For in Kestrel's. And I'm sure. So if that's there, I have to just be curious. Now, how many people take advantage of that, or how many are just accepting what's presented? Do you track that telemetry?
We have not yet, essentially, again, we have it in our reports of what's changed, resolved, addressed, but in addition to being the compliance analysis that's actually running against your Revit model, we have a web portal where you're seeing all the past reports. So from kind of that high level person whose time is potentially being saved the most because they would be doing these additional reviews over and over, that they can see, okay, my team is running reports. I can see that when we started SD, we had 700 compliance analysis issues. And I see that 2 weeks later, okay, they've been running it again. They're using this as an input. We're down to 520. So from that kind of eagle eye view, additionally, that we want this to be, even when you are not the person resolving compliance issues in real time, that you have a level of oversight of how your team is working through these. So it always can be audited. Go right ahead, sorry.
Oh, that's all right. I'm getting excited and I interrupt. The question I have then is, you mentioned some firms that have multiple projects that are running. Have you seen where there may be the same team? I don't know if you've been around long enough necessarily for this to be the case yet, but maybe you will, where they've done one project, moved to the next, and you've seen the number of issues flagged start to decrease, indicating some sort of pedagogic outcome?
We have not yet, but our anticipation is very much that we will. And we've built additionally, that kind of data and graphic oversight layer so that when you're logging into the portal, you have not only the view of your project by project ticking down through those violations, but you can see, okay, our first project started with, XYZ amount. Second, further to your point that it's increasing returns, that folks are already knowing that they need to input this data. And part of that is, these initial projects that we're working through is we're working on model health and working with people's BIM managers additionally to say, this is that incentive structure of where that data lies, where it's nested, so that we as Kestrel get better at reading it, so that team members and junior modelers understand why it's important to have that level of kind of Revit lifeguarding, essentially. I think going back to each person models a little bit differently, each firm models a little bit differently, getting that incentive structure of you will have an easier time, you will get better feedback, and have less work doing compliance analysis, doing red lines, doing QA on the backside, building in that reward is part of what we're doing as well in these initial partnerships.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. So we're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask before we leave, what's sort of the next step? What do you mentioned that maybe a closer relationship with customers right now, but I'm assuming that you're looking for new customers, and where should people go for more information and try out your product?
Go to kestrellabs.com, reach out to us. You can do a free trial. You can do kind of an onboarding where we work hand in glove to really understand and set you up. We really want to meet folks where you are. We believe in this product. We believe in architecture and artists and, kind of the opportunity for this really to be a quality of life tool. We'd love to talk to you. We'd love to work with your firm. We'd love to see what you're working on.
That is a hopeful and I think really nice message to end on. Marissa, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Roderick. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for running us down at AIA. This was wonderful.
Yeah, no problem. I should probably be doing that more often with people. So
that's perfect. Thanks so much. Have a good one.